Judge shames a black nurse over her scrubs. Then her words leave the courtroom on its feet. "You call this proper courtroom attire?" The judge's voice sliced through the chatter like a scalpel. The entire courtroom froze. Jasmine Cole, 36, mother of 2, stood tall in the middle of it all. Faded navy blue scrubs, sneakers smudged with blood, and exhaustion clinging to her skin like a second layer. She didn't blink. Not when Judge Meredith Langford narrowed her eyes at her. Not when whispers rippled through the gallery. Not when even her own attorney stiffened beside her. "Ma'am," Jasmine said calmly, voice steady despite the weight on her chest. "This uniform has blood on it because I was holding a 6-year-old boy's heart in my hands at 4:07 this morning. He flatlined twice. I didn't have time to go home and change. I had just enough time to decide if I'd let a child die or risk being scolded by this court." Gasps. A sharp inhale from someone in the second row. Judge Langford's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. No one moved. The only sound was the humming buzz of the overhead fluorescence. For a long beat, even the bailiff, who had started to step forward, froze in place. Jasmine didn't fidget, didn't flinch. The ID badge on her chest still read Saint. Luke's Medical, Trauma, RN, J. Cole. Her hands bore the imprint of gloves she hadn't even had time to remove properly. A smear of dried ink from the ER trauma board streaked the inside of her forearm. "I don't mean any disrespect," Jasmine added softly, "but these improper clothes kept a child alive tonight. I figured that was enough to justify showing up late and in uniform." The judge said nothing, because what could she say? It was too late. The courtroom had already decided whose voice they believed, and outside, in a world obsessed with image and headlines, someone had caught every second on camera. 12 hours earlier, Jasmine's shift had started like any other, with half a granola bar in the break room and the dull weight of a court summons in her bag. Night shifts were nothing new. Chaos wasn't either. But tonight the trauma pager never stopped. 3 car accidents, a shooting, and then the boy. No ID, no parents. He'd been rushed in after collapsing in gym class, barely breathing. Jasmine had worked beside a trauma surgeon and 2 interns, too green to know how to keep their hands from shaking. She led the code. She whispered to the boy even when he had no pulse, and when the monitors finally leveled out, she glanced at the clock. 7:53 a.m. Her custody hearing started in just over an hour. No time for a shower. No time for anything but a brisk hand wash and a prayer that her kids hadn't missed the school bus. She drove across the city, heart pounding, court papers still folded in the pocket of her hoodie. Her ex-husband, Miles Chandler, was already seated when she walked in, flanked by his sharply dressed attorney, Andrew Kellis. Jasmine saw the smirk on Kellis's face when she entered, saw him nudge Miles. He whispered something, then adjusted his cufflinks. Custom silver, monogrammed. She knew how this was going to go. Kellis had filed for partial custody just 2 weeks earlier, arguing Jasmine was emotionally unstable, overworked, and unavailable to parent. And she knew he'd use everything against her. Every overnight shift, every school pickup her mom had to cover, every missed PTA meeting. But what she hadn't expected was to be shamed before she even opened her mouth. Judge Langford had a reputation for being hard-lined on decorum. No phones, no late arrivals, no exceptions. But Jasmine had believed for once that the court might prioritize something more than optics. She was wrong. "Miss Cole," Judge Langford had said, voice clipped, "this is a courtroom, not a break room." And that's when Jasmine had said it. About the child, about the choice. And that's when everything shifted. Her lawyer, Noah Briggs, tried to speak up, started to interject with something about the circumstances. But Jasmine had already taken control of the narrative with nothing more than quiet truth. The gallery had leaned in, A young woman in the back pulled out her phone, recorded, uploaded. Hashtags began to form mid-hearing. Our nurse justice, our scrubs, our respect. Let her wear it. But Jasmine didn't know that yet. She was too busy trying to keep her breathing steady as Andrew Kellis stood up from his polished leather seat and swaggered toward the podium. "Miss Cole," he began, oozing the same smugness he'd worn like cologne during mediation. "Can you confirm that you voluntarily chose to work an overnight shift before this court appearance?" "Yes," Jasmine answered, still calm. Kellis raised an eyebrow. "Knowing you had a legal obligation this morning?" "Yes," she repeated. "So then," he said, voice rising just a notch, "is it fair to say that you prioritized your job, your hospital duties, over your responsibilities as a mother and over this very important proceeding?" There it was. The dagger. The twist he'd been waiting to drive in. Jasmine blinked once, then leaned forward. "No, sir. What I did was choose the kind of parent I want my children to grow up remembering." The silence returned, thicker this time. "I chose," she continued, "to stay by the side of a stranger's son whose mother wasn't there, and I did that because if it were my son coding on that table at 4 a.m., I'd want someone to do the same for him." Even Judge Langford's posture shifted, just a degree, but Jasmine saw it. "I didn't neglect my children," she added. "I honored them. With every life I protect, I teach them what it means to show up when no one else will. And this uniform, feeds them, shelters them, pays for their therapy after their father walked out. So if you want to say I'm not fit to be their mother because I didn't have time to iron a blouse, then go ahead." Kellis opened his mouth, but no words came. Behind him, someone coughed. Another person dabbed their eye. Jasmine looked down for the first time since she'd entered the courtroom, not in shame, but to steady herself. She was tired, but not broken. And when she looked up again, something had shifted. Not just in the room, but in the system. Outside the courtroom, views were already rising. By the time the judge called for recess, Jasmine Cole had gone viral. But she didn't know that either. She was too busy watching the clock because she had to pick her daughter up from school in an hour. In the same scrubs, in the same blood, in the same dignity. And that courtroom, once so eager to judge her by appearance, wasn't quiet anymore out of condescension. It was quiet out of awe. By the time Jasmine stepped out of the courtroom, she could feel it. Something in the air had shifted. Not just the buzzing of phones or the sideways glances from strangers who'd witnessed her take on the system in blood-stained scrubs. Something deeper, a current, like the first moment before a storm breaks. Her lawyer, Noah Briggs, walked beside her down the narrow hallway. He'd been practicing law for over a decade, but he looked as stunned as a rookie who had just watched the rulebook catch fire. "You realize what just happened in there," he said, still breathless. "I testified," Jasmine replied, tucking her hands into her scrub pockets. "That's what I was called here to do." "No," he said, stopping short. "You didn't just testify. You held the whole room hostage without raising your voice." Jasmine leaned against the wall, eyes on the digital clock ticking above the clerk's station. She had 27 minutes before she had to be at her daughter's school. She didn't have time to unpack what she'd just lived through, or what was coming next, because something was definitely coming. Down the hallway she saw people whispering, phones lit up in their palms. A court clerk glanced over at her, eyes wide with something between admiration and disbelief. A bailiff, one who had barely acknowledged her before, offered a nod. She gave a faint one back, then checked her phone. 17 missed texts, 3 voicemails, and 1 link. She tapped it and watched the clip begin to play. Grainy courtroom footage, shot from the back row. Her voice, calm and measured, filled the speaker. These scrubs still carry the pulse of a child who would be dead if I'd stopped to change. There was a pause. Then another voice, deeper, more frantic, spoke off camera. "Yo, did she just say that to the judge?" And then silence. A still frame of Jasmine standing, lit by courtroom fluorescence, jaw set like she'd come out of war. The caption read, "Black nurse dragged for wearing scrubs to court. Her clapback leaves judge speechless." Jasmine's stomach turned. It had begun. Back inside, Judge Langford hadn't recessed for long. The bailiff called court back into session just 20 minutes later. When Jasmine returned to her seat, the room had changed. People were no longer slouching or checking their watches. They were watching her, not with pity, with something like reverence. Andrew Kellis, meanwhile, looked like he'd aged 5 years in the span of 30 minutes. His posture had shifted. The confidence had cracked. He rose from his seat a moment later, face drawn, and requested to submit additional evidence. Photos of Jasmine's apartment, school attendance reports, a half-baked attempt to reclaim control. But Noah, emboldened by Jasmine's performance, pounced. "Objection, Your Honor," he said, rising quickly. "These records were not submitted in pre-trial discovery, and my client hasn't had time to review them." Judge Langford didn't even look at Kelly's when she responded. Sustained. A small gasp escaped from the gallery, and Jasmine realized something then. The shift she had felt. It wasn't just in public opinion or courtroom etiquette. It was in the judge herself. Langford wasn't just rattled, she was reckoning. Still, Kellis didn't stop. He paced the front of the courtroom like a man trying to outrun a mistake. "Miss Cole," he said finally, "would you agree that by arriving to court dressed as you are, you intentionally dramatized your entrance in order to sway this courtroom emotionally?" Jasmine turned her head slowly, fixing him with a look that burned through his tailored suit. "No," she said, "but if this courtroom is swayed by the truth, then maybe that's not a flaw. It's a function." Noah nearly choked on a laugh, covering it quickly with a cough. "And just to be clear," Kellis continued, "you had ample time to stop home before your appearance today." "No," Jasmine said flatly. "You didn't think it appropriate to present yourself differently. I thought saving a child's life was appropriate." Another ripple from the gallery. Jasmine could feel the support rising behind her like a tide. Judge Langford leaned forward then, her fingers tented in front of her lips. "Mr. Kellis, I believe we've gone over this." But Kellis wasn't ready to quit. He pointed to Jasmine's uniform. "That attire is the reason a boy is alive," she interrupted, voice louder now. "And you keep trying to make it the reason I don't deserve my children." The silence that followed was different than before. Heavy. Loaded. That was when the door at the back of the courtroom opened. Every head turned. A woman stepped in, mid-50s, dark hair streaked with silver, pressed white coat over slacks and flats. She carried no bag, no briefcase, just a small envelope and a face Jasmine hadn't seen since last year. It was Dr. Reina Santiago, the chief of emergency medicine. Jasmine blinked. She hadn't been told she was coming. "I apologize for interrupting, Doctor," Santiago said, walking briskly toward the bench. "But I've been called to speak on behalf of Miss Cole," Kelly sputtered. "Your Honor, this witness was not listed." "She may proceed," Judge Langford said. Jasmine sat back slowly, pulse thudding in her ears. She didn't ask for this. She never asked for anyone to fight her battles. But Dr. Santiago wasn't just her boss. She was her standard, her compass. "I've known Nurse Jasmine Cole for 7 years," Santiago began, standing tall. "And I have never seen her treat her profession like a costume. She is the nurse we send into the worst trauma bays." She is the voice we follow when seconds matter. And she is the reason, this morning, a boy with no name went home with breath in his lungs. Then she turned to face the bench directly. She didn't come here to make a statement, but maybe it's time the system makes one. A beat. Then she opened the envelope. A letter, she said, from the boy's parents. They wrote it in the ER waiting room. I'd like to read it, if the court allows. Langford gave a small nod. Dr. Santiago unfolded the note. To whom it may concern, if Jasmine Cole hadn't stayed past her shift, our son would not be breathing. Give her children back. She's earned them 100 times over. You could hear a pin drop. Even Kelly's looked like the wind had been knocked out of him. Judge Langford didn't speak. She didn't need to, because Jasmine Scrubs had already said everything. When court recessed for lunch, Jasmine barely had the strength to walk out of the room. Not from nerves, she had long learned to bury those, but from the weight of the morning. The silence that had filled the courtroom wasn't silence at all. It had been a slow, building roar of judgment, support, disbelief, and power-shifting hands. And she had stood at the center of it without flinching. She stepped into the hallway like someone stepping out of combat. The door shut behind her with a muffled thud. Outside, the hallway wasn't quiet. Reporters hovered near the exits. People who hadn't even been in the courtroom were now hanging around, asking others for details, for quotes. Phones were out. Faces were turned. Every movement was recorded. She ignored it all. Her hands shook slightly as she opened a granola bar and leaned against the cold wall. Noah joined her seconds later, his tie loose, expression unreadable. "You're not just trending," he said, scrolling his phone. "You've detonated." Jasmine didn't look up. "I'm not trying to be a movement. I just want my kids." "I know," Noah said. Then, softer, "But it might be bigger than that now." At the end of the hallway, the crowd parted slightly as a young woman in a suit, barely in her 20s, walked up nervously. A court clerk. She held her phone in both hands, unsure if she was even allowed to approach. "Ms. Cole?" she asked shyly. I wanted to say thank you. My mom's a nurse. She used to cry in the car after shifts, and no one ever understood why. Today, when you spoke, I did." Jasmine gave her a tired smile. "Then we're even, because you just gave me the energy to walk back in there." The girl beamed and walked off, and Jasmine turned to Noah. "That's why I wore the scrubs." Before he could answer, the court officer called everyone back inside. By the time she re-entered, something had changed. The gallery had tripled. Strangers stood along the back wall, silent but present. Half a dozen nurses in scrubs lined one side of the courtroom, arms crossed in quiet defiance. EMTs. 2 firefighters. A doctor she didn't recognize. Uniforms everywhere. They were there for her. Judge Langford took her seat at the bench slowly. Her expression was unreadable, but something about the way she scanned the room, pausing ever so slightly on each uniform, told Jasmine this was no longer about just one case. "We are back in session," Langford said. "But before we proceed to arguments, this court will allow one final witness if the defense chooses to present." Noah rose. "Yes, Your Honor, we call Dr. Reina Santiago." As Santiago returned to the stand, the entire room held its breath. "I won't repeat what I've already said," she began, "but I will clarify something. Miss Cole didn't come here in scrubs to protest or disrespect this court. She came in them because she stayed to resuscitate a child, and then she walked into this courtroom, still wearing the blood of someone else's son, because she had no time. Not for makeup, not for ironing, not even for grief. Just truth." She paused, letting that sink in. "There's a mistake being made here," Santiago continued. "It's not the kind of mistake you fix with a strike from the record. It's the kind of mistake that comes from forgetting what real service looks like. Jasmine sat frozen, her eyes stinging. Miss Cole is not unstable. She is not unfit. She is overworked, yes. Exhausted, yes. But not unfit. She is exactly the kind of parent this country needs more of. Kelly shifted in his seat, but even he didn't rise. Not yet. Not now. Santiago reached into her pocket and pulled out a second letter. "This," she said, holding it up, "is from the trauma surgeon who worked with her this morning. He couldn't be here today because he's still operating on the boy they saved. But he wanted the court to know something." She unfolded the page. "When the team started to lose that kid, we froze, all of us. But Jasmine didn't. She took over, she led us, and she brought him back. Twice. I've worked with doctors with medals on their walls who couldn't stay that steady. She didn't just save that boy, she taught everyone in the room how to fight for a life, even when the odds say it's lost." Silence. Then Judge Langford leaned back slightly. "Thank you, Doctor." Santiago Noah stood again. "The defense rests, Your Honor." Langford turned to Kellis. "Mr. Kellis, you may proceed with your closing." But Kellis didn't move. He opened his mouth, then looked at Jasmine, looked at the crowd, then shook his head slowly. "No, Your Honor," he said, voice low. "I withdraw. The evidence is clear, the gallery is clear, and frankly, I'm ashamed I ever tried to argue against her." A murmur spread across the room. Jasmine didn't react, couldn't. Noah sat down beside her. That's never happened before. But she wasn't listening. She was staring straight ahead, beyond the judge, beyond the paneled walls and the polished floor, to something no one else could see. It wasn't vindication. It was recognition. And it felt like oxygen after hours in a windowless trauma bay. Judge Langford cleared her throat. "This court will return in 1 hour with a decision." Then she rose and walked out, not with the certainty of a judge who had everything under control, but like a woman who had just learned something she didn't know she'd forgotten. As the room began to empty, Jasmine remained seated. She didn't want applause. She just wanted her kids. And maybe, just maybe, a world that no longer made her defend why she showed up in the clothes she wore to save lives. Judge Meredith Langford sat in her chambers, the door closed behind her with a muted click. She didn't reach for her coffee, didn't open her laptop. Instead, she stared at the transcript in her lap. The clerk had already printed the morning session, every word Jasmine Cole had spoken, now inked in courier font, line by line. But Langford wasn't reading as a judge anymore. She was reading as a mother. And it burned. Her own son was grown now, a defense attorney in Chicago, polished and distant. Meredith had spent decades mastering control of her courtroom, her image, her expectations. But nowhere in that careful scaffolding had she ever been forced to choose between duty and child in the same breath. Not like Jasmine had. She flipped back to a line she couldn't stop rereading. "I didn't choose between my job and my children. I chose to be the kind of mother I'd want to show up if they ever needed saving." It wasn't just eloquent. It was devastating. She glanced at her reflection in the dark window, black robe folded neatly on the back of her chair. Her hair was perfectly set, her suit crisp beneath the robe. And yet she'd never felt more exposed. She had mocked a woman who had just saved a child's life. Worse, she had done it out of reflex, out of routine. She'd thought herself a guardian of order. Instead, she'd nearly buried truth beneath protocol. There was a knock on the door. Her clerk leaned in. "Judge, you asked for the media log." Langford nodded and took the folder without a word. Inside was a printout of trending videos, tweets, and national coverage. Jasmine's clip had reached 3.2 million views in less than 4 hours. The court had gone viral. She scrolled through a few headlines. "Nurse shamed in court." Defends with dignity, judge mocked her scrubs. Then the world listened, a black mother's words that stopped the room. Langford closed the folder and pressed her hands to her temples. This was no longer just a ruling. This was a reckoning. Meanwhile, back in the hallway, Jasmine sat on a wooden bench, head bowed, arms folded across her chest. She hadn't spoken much since the recess. The weight of the testimony, the support, the sudden swirl of attention, it all pressed in like a wall. Noah sat beside her, still glued to his phone. They're already calling it a landmark custody hearing. A judge is trending. You're trending. I didn't ask for any of this, she murmured. I know. That's why it matters. Across the hall, a woman approached, middle-aged, stylish, clipboard in hand. A producer from a major news network. Jasmine clocked it immediately. The practiced smile, the soft-voiced pitch. Miss Cole, she began. I'm sorry to interrupt, but would you be open to a live interview? Just a few minutes. America's watching, and they're inspired. You've become a symbol. Jasmine looked up at her, then said flatly, I'm not a symbol. I'm a nurse who didn't have time to change clothes because I was holding a child's chest together. The producer faltered. Of course, that's exactly the kind of authenticity people... No, Jasmine said again, more firm this time. Not today. The woman backed off, chastened. Noah glanced at her, impressed. You could have eaten that woman alive. I'm tired, Jasmine said. Not cruel. Inside the courtroom, preparations for the final ruling had begun. A new energy buzzed through the walls, something electric, unpredictable. And yet, under it all, something steady pulsed. Jasmine had brought something into that room no one had expected. Not just a challenge to decorum, but a call to conscience. Judge Langford returned to the bench precisely at 2 p.m. She sat straighter now, her voice firmer, but not colder. This court has reviewed testimony, documentation, and public record. Before we proceed, I want to address something for the record. She looked directly at Jasmine. Earlier today, I questioned your appearance. I referred to your uniform as inappropriate for this courtroom. I was wrong, not just in tone, but in judgment. You could hear the air shift. I failed to recognize that real respect isn't stitched into fabric. It's shown in action. And what you wore here today wasn't an insult to this institution. It was a reminder of what this institution should serve. She turned to the court reporter. Strike all previous remarks concerning Miss Cole's attire from the record, permanently. A soft gasp escaped the gallery. Then silence. Langford wasn't finished. This courtroom has seen well-dressed deception and tailored lies. Today we saw someone walk in after saving a life, only to be told she didn't look the part. And she taught all of us, myself included, what strength really looks like. Then she turned to the attorneys. We will now hear final arguments, though I doubt they are needed. Noah rose, but said nothing at first. Then, Your Honor, I believe my client already delivered her closing argument, with her presence, her work, and her truth. Langford nodded slowly. Kelly stood, glanced once at Jasmine, then shook his head. No argument, Your Honor. Langford leaned forward. Then I'll prepare my ruling. As she stood to leave, she paused once more. And Miss Cole, thank you. Not just for what you did today, but for what you do when no one's watching. Jasmine remained seated, eyes lowered. Because it wasn't about the applause. It was about the child she'd saved, the children she was fighting for, and the truth that had finally, quietly, taken its place at the bench. By the time the courtroom doors opened again, word had spread beyond just trending topics. It had become a movement. Outside, clusters of people had gathered, nurses still in scrubs, EMTs on their break, med students clutching their textbooks. Someone held a sign that read, "Respect the uniform, respect the heart." Another simply said, Jasmine Cole, we see you. Inside, the crowd was denser than ever. The judge's bench stood at its usual height, but everything else felt leveled. The power in the room had shifted, not to chaos, but to clarity. This wasn't just about custody anymore. This was about what justice looked like when it finally listened. Jasmine walked back to her seat quietly. Her scrubs were wrinkled now, sweat damp around the collar. The dried stain of blood on her sleeve had turned a darker maroon, barely visible unless you looked closely. She didn't bother to fix her hair, didn't try to straighten the crease in her pocket. She was done trying to fit the mold. Judge Langford returned to the bench with a different presence, still firm, still measured, but something behind her gaze had softened, humbled. "The court is back in session," she said, then paused. "Before I issue a decision, I want to say something plainly." All eyes locked on her. "When this morning began, I believed I was protecting the dignity of this courtroom by enforcing its decorum. What I failed to recognize was that real dignity sometimes shows up in unexpected clothing. In this case, it showed up in scrubs, worn by a woman who had just held a dying child's hand. I misjudged not only your attire, Miss Cole, but your presence." The gallery sat breathless. She turned to the bailiff. "Please open the rear doors. If those outside wish to witness this, they may." Gasps stirred. The bailiff hesitated, then moved, and for the first time anyone could remember, a courtroom invited in a crowd. Within minutes, the back of the gallery filled with people standing shoulder to shoulder. Nurses in blue, red, green, firefighters in turnout gear, a grocery store clerk in uniform, a janitor still wearing gloves. Judge Langford took it in, and for a moment, she looked overwhelmed. "This," she said, gesturing to the crowd, "is what justice should look like. Not just a courtroom full of rules, but a community full of truth." She turned toward Jasmine. "Miss Cole, you said you didn't choose between your job and your children, that you chose to be the kind of mother who would show up if her own child ever needed saving." Jasmine nodded silently. "That line stayed with me," Langford continued. "It stayed with everyone who heard it, because it forced us to confront something courts rarely do. How much of justice is about presence, not perfection?" She leaned forward slightly. "You came into this room exhausted, in uniform, vulnerable, and instead of shrinking, you stood. You didn't shout. You didn't grandstand. You told the truth, and you changed the temperature of the air." There was a long silence. Then the judge added, "I have rendered a decision, but before I speak it, let it be known that this courtroom is not just issuing a ruling. It's issuing a correction." From the bench, she turned to the court reporter. "Let the record reflect that Miss Cole's presence today elevated, not disrupted, these proceedings." A man in the gallery clapped once instinctively, then stopped himself. But he wasn't alone. Within seconds, the sound of hands coming together began to ripple through the room. Not loud, not celebratory, just honest, reverent. The judge waited, allowing it to crest and fade before continuing. "Full legal and physical custody of the minor children will remain with Miss Jasmine Cole." Jasmine closed her eyes. A breath she hadn't even known she'd been holding finally left her. "There is no legal evidence to suggest Miss Cole is unfit. In fact, there is substantial evidence, documented, witnessed, and now lived, that she is a stable, present, and deeply capable parent." Noah exhaled sharply beside her, his smile visible now. But the judge wasn't finished. "This court also acknowledges that the manner in which Miss Cole was initially addressed was inappropriate, and going forward, any nurse, paramedic, or medical professional who appears in this courtroom directly from duty will be offered water, not warnings." Jasmine's eyes welled, but she didn't cry. She'd cried enough in rooms where no one watched. This wasn't about release. It was about recognition. Langford's voice cracked ever so slightly as she finished. Sometimes justice doesn't wear a suit. Sometimes it walks in with frayed laces, weary eyes, and scrubs stained with sacrifice. She stood, folding her hands. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down, not with force, but with finality. Then the room rose, not out of decorum, not out of obligation. They stood for her, one by one like a wave, nurses, officers, strangers. Every single person who had once looked at her with question now looked at her with something else entirely. Respect. Jasmine didn't stand right away. She needed a second. Her breath trembled. Her chest swelled. And when she finally rose, it wasn't for herself. It was for every parent who'd ever walked into a courtroom already bleeding from the fight it took just to get there. The applause wasn't thunderous. It was honest. The sound of a system being reminded who it's supposed to protect. And in that moment, Jasmine Cole didn't just win a case. She changed the rules. The applause didn't end with the gavel. It followed Jasmine into the hallway like an echo that refused to fade. She didn't linger. She didn't speak to reporters or take selfies with nurses or let anyone ask what it felt like to win. She just walked, past the marble columns, past the crowd, down the courthouse steps where her two children waited, sitting side by side on the stone ledge, swinging their legs like it was any ordinary afternoon. "Mom," her daughter Riley asked, "did we win?" Jasmine knelt in front of her, ignoring the flashing cameras now pointed their way. "We did," she said, "but it's not about winning, baby. It's about showing up." Riley tilted her head. "You mean like you do at the hospital?" Jasmine smiled, brushing a curl behind the girl's ear. "Exactly like that." Behind her, the crowd outside had grown even larger. Some held flowers, others just stood, quietly, watching her as if they'd just seen something sacred unfold. And maybe they had. Noah stepped in beside her, clutching his phone like it might combust in his hand. "It's on every major network now. CNN just ran a headline, 'The Scrubs That Spoke Louder Than the Law.' Fox ran with, 'Judge Humbled by Nurse in Custody Standoff.'" Jasmine stood, one hand on each child's shoulder. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." "You didn't," Noah replied, "but you were honest. And the world hasn't seen that in a courtroom for a long time." As they made their way toward the parking lot, something unexpected happened. One of the court officers stepped forward, a burly white-haired man who hadn't so much as glanced at her that morning. He removed his cap. "Miss Cole," he said, "I just wanted to say, I've worked here 27 years, thought I'd seen everything, but today, well, thank you." She nodded. "For what?" "For reminding us what the badge is supposed to protect." She didn't have a response. Only a soft thank you, before turning back to her children. At home, there was no celebration, no champagne, just leftovers reheated in the microwave, the kids bickering over who got the last biscuit, and the steady thud of normal life picking up exactly where it left off. Jasmine was folding laundry when the doorbell rang. On her porch stood a woman in a blazer holding a sealed envelope and a badge clipped to her hip. A government type, tall, polished, and distinctly out of place in Jasmine's modest neighborhood. "Miss Cole?" "Yes." "My name is Dana Price. I work with the Department of Health and Human Services. Do you mind if I come in?" Jasmine hesitated. "If this is about media, I'm not doing interviews." "It's not that," Dana said. "It's about policy." Inside, seated at the kitchen table with a juice box pushed aside to make room, Dana opened the envelope and slid a folder across the table. "You've sparked something, Miss Cole, something we've been trying to push through for years." Jasmine glanced down. The document was titled, "The Cole Provision, Courtroom Attire Reform for Medical Responders." Dana tapped the heading. 3 states are already drafting versions of this: New York, California, and Pennsylvania. It would prohibit judges from penalizing medical workers for attire when appearing after an active shift. You gave us the human face this legislation needed. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, processing. I'm not looking to be a spokesperson. You don't have to be, Dana said. You already are. The next morning, the story ran on the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer. The photo showed Jasmine holding her daughter's hand, court steps in the background, the caption reading, Mother, Nurse, Catalyst. At St. Luke's Medical Center, nurses were allowed to wear their scrubs wherever they went for a week in her honor. Even hospital administration got in on it, donning uniforms in solidarity. In a pediatric ER in Houston, a nurse hung Jasmine's courtroom photo next to a sign that read, Dignity doesn't need to change clothes. Back at the courthouse, Judge Langford called a private meeting with the state's judicial board. She had already issued a formal apology. Now she was pushing to amend courtroom dress code policies statewide. Because, she told them, I refuse to ever again question the attire of someone who came straight from saving a life. And yet, amid all of this, laws, headlines, reform, Jasmine kept her head down, kept showing up for shifts, kept packing lunch for her kids. She turned down every major interview request, refused a book deal, declined a documentary cruise proposal. Because none of this had been about going viral. It had been about surviving the weight of judgment, about standing in her truth long enough for the world to finally see it. 1 week later, while dropping Riley off at school, a teacher pulled Jasmine aside and held up a crayon drawing. A little stick figure woman in blue scrubs stood tall with the words, My hero wears sneakers. Jasmine's breath caught. That's what she told the class, the teacher said. She said you didn't need a cape. You just needed to care. Jasmine smiled, tears slipping down her cheek as she took the drawing in both hands. Sometimes, it turns out, the most powerful legacies aren't built in courtrooms. They're built in kitchens, in classrooms, and in the tiny hands of those who saw you when you thought the world never would. 3 weeks after the hearing, Jasmine Cole received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Just her name, written in sharp black ink across the front. No legal header, no seal, but the handwriting was unmistakably familiar. It was Judge Langford's. Inside, a single sheet of paper, typed, unsigned, unformatted. Not an official court communication, just a message. I've sat on the bench for 22 years. That morning I saw myself clearly for the first time, and I didn't like what I saw. Thank you for showing me the mirror, even if it cut. Jasmine folded the letter and placed it in her bedside drawer, without a word. That afternoon she was back on the floor of St. Luke's ER. There was no spotlight there, no speeches, just broken bones, a child with an allergic reaction, and an elderly man whispering his wife's name through oxygen tubes, and Jasmine, always moving, always present, remained exactly where she belonged. But outside her hospital, the storm she'd sparked kept building. In Sacramento, a nurse had been removed from court for wearing scrubs after a double shift. A bystander recorded it. The internet exploded. Local lawmakers cited the coal provision on the floor of the California State Assembly. In D.C., a bipartisan group of representatives began crafting federal legislation to address judicial bias in appearance-based rulings. And in Philadelphia, the city where it had all started, Jasmine found herself being summoned again. But not to court. This time it was the State Museum of American Labor and Service. She sat in a quiet office, her hands resting on her lap, as a curator named Lisa Darnell spoke in an almost reverent tone. We're creating a new wing, Lisa explained. Stories of unseen labor. The people who hold the country together without asking for attention. Jasmine raised an eyebrow. I'm not sure I belong in a museum. Lisa smiled. You wore scrubs into a courtroom and shook the entire system. You absolutely belong. The request was simple. They wanted the scrubs, the exact pair, the ones she wore that day. Jasmine hesitated. The fabric had been washed, folded, placed at the bottom of her drawer like something sacred. She hadn't touched them since the verdict, but she remembered every wrinkle, every stain that hadn't quite come out, the ink near the hip from the trauma board marker, the blood that wasn't hers. "These don't feel like mine anymore," she whispered. "They feel like everyone's." Lisa nodded. "Then maybe that's exactly why they should be behind glass." Jasmine mailed them the next morning. She didn't tell anyone, not even her kids. But a week later, her son Malik came home from school holding a flyer. "Mom," he said, "you're in a museum?" Jasmine froze. "What?" He held it out, a glossy handout with a picture of the exhibit, a glass case, a plaque beside it that read, "The Scrubs That Showed Up," worn by Nurse Jasmine Cole on the day she changed how courtrooms see sacrifice. She laughed, the sound more breath than voice, then muttered, "They really put that on a wall?" Malik nodded. "We're taking a field trip there next month." Later that evening, her daughter Riley climbed into bed beside her and asked, "Do you think people will forget?" Jasmine turned toward her, tucking the blanket around them both. "They might forget my name," she said, "but I don't think they'll forget what we showed them." "What did we show them?" "That being strong doesn't mean being loud. It means showing up, especially when it's hard, especially when it's unfair." Riley pressed her face into Jasmine's shoulder. "I want to be like you." Jasmine smiled into the dark. "Then be braver than me." The next day, something extraordinary happened. Schools across the country began celebrating a new observance, Scrubs Day. A day where students, teachers, and administrators came dressed in medical uniforms, honoring those who worked in silence, in pressure, in exhaustion. A teacher in Chicago called it Modern Courage Day. At St. Luke's, Jasmine walked into the break room to find every doctor, tech, and even the janitorial staff in matching badges that read, "I showed up." And just when she thought the noise had finally faded, the call came. A congressional staffer, official, director. "Miss Cole," the voice said, "you've been invited to testify before a subcommittee regarding national courtroom decorum policy. They want to hear your perspective." Jasmine sat on the edge of her bed, phone pressed to her ear, eyes unfocused. "I'm not a politician," she said. "No," the woman replied. "You're something better. You're the reason people are finally listening." She didn't answer right away. Outside, her kids laughed as they chased each other in the yard. The sky was wide and clear, and the house smelled like toast and laundry. Jasmine closed her eyes. "All right," she said finally, "but I'm coming in scrubs." The hearing room on Capitol Hill was colder than any courtroom Jasmine had ever been in, but the weight in the air felt the same. Rows of polished seats, suits, and microphones, photographers positioned in quiet clusters. Her name printed on a folded placard in front of her. No robe, no gavel, just her, a mic, and a choice. The chairman introduced her as a nurse who became a national voice for those who serve before they're ever seen. Jasmine adjusted the collar of her fresh navy scrubs and leaned forward. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I'm not here because I wanted to be," she began. "I'm here because I didn't leave." A pause. "I didn't leave a boy coding on a table at 4 a.m. I didn't leave the courtroom when I was humiliated for what I wore after saving him. And I'm not leaving today without saying this. There are thousands of others who carry lives on their backs, who walk into systems that measure them by polish and not purpose. And they keep showing up." She glanced at the senators across from her. "If my scrubs made you uncomfortable, imagine what it feels like to be in them." Her words settled like dust across the room, quiet, unshakable. The hearing lasted 2 more hours, but it wasn't about bills anymore. It was about reckoning. One lawmaker whispered to another, "She just said more with that uniform than we ever could with a speech." When it was over, Jasmine didn't wait for applause. She stood, thanked the committee, and walked out into the brisk DC wind like she had somewhere to be, because she always did. But the story didn't end there. Within 2 months, the coal provision passed through Congress with bipartisan support. Courtrooms across the country amended their decorum policies. Judicial codes were rewritten to include exceptions for essential workers appearing post-shift. A national campaign launched, "Show up, don't dress up." And yet, none of that mattered more than what happened in Jasmine's hometown. One morning, while preparing school lunches, her daughter Riley ran into the kitchen holding a flyer. "Mom, guess what? They changed Nurses' Day." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "Changed it how?" "They renamed it," Riley said, eyes sparkling. "It's now called Jasmine Cole Day, at least here in Philly. It's official. We get to wear scrubs to school and talk about you." Jasmine laughed, half choked on her coffee. "Oh no, I did not ask for that." Riley beamed. "Well, you got it anyway." Outside, church bells rang. Across town, hospital workers pulled into garages with bumper stickers that read, "She showed up." Students wore badges with her quote, "Be present, even when you're tired." At the State Museum, Jasmine's scrubs sat beside a 9/11 firefighter's jacket and a miner's helmet from Appalachia. Beneath the display, the plaque simply read, "Courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just doesn't change clothes." Still, Jasmine never moved to Washington, never hired an agent. She stayed where she'd always belonged, on night shifts, in trauma bays, at school drop-offs, and late-night kitchen tables filled with homework, juice boxes, and love. And in one last quiet moment, on a Sunday morning, she stepped into her daughter's room to find Riley writing a school essay titled, "What It Means to Be Brave." Jasmine sat on the edge of the bed and read it. It ended with a line she didn't see coming. "My mom doesn't just save people, she reminds the world how to see them." And that, Jasmine thought, was more than enough. To everyone watching this story, if it moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel seen, subscribe to the channel. Share this story. Because there are thousands of Jasmines out there showing up every day, and the world deserves to hear them too. This isn't just about one courtroom. It's about how we treat the people who keep us alive. Let's make sure they never walk in unseen again.